We have Dr. David Coyle with us, who's been promoted to a co-host. So Dr. David Coyle, as I introduce you, if you want to start sharing your screen, you can. So I will stop sharing and I will introduce you. So Dr. David Coyle is an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. His extension and research program focuses on forest and tree health and invasive species management in natural and managed landscapes across the Southeast. He has published 96 peer-reviewed journal articles, 7 book chapters, and 46 fact sheets. He has co-written forest health field guides for several states and helped create educational materials for professionals and non-professionals on everything from kudzu to southern pine beetles to Juro spiders. Dave grew up on a farm in Harmony, Minnesota, and completed his BA in biology at Luther College, a MS in entomology and forestry at Iowa State University, and a PhD in entomology at the University of Wisconsin. He is past president of the North American Invasive Species Management Association and has won national awards from the Society of American Foresters, Forest Landowner Association, and Entomological Society of America. So welcome, Dr. David Coyle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. I trust you're refueled after your break to talk about the worst tree we have. So I have been chatting about this topic for a few years now, and I will have plenty of things to say. Let's dive in, shall we? So just to give you a little background, we'll start with some invasive plant information, what makes one, what doesn't make one, and then we'll get into the Bradford pear itself. Bradford versus Callery Pear, kind of what the situation is, how do we manage it, and then how can we use public outreach as a bit of some opportunities here. You guys get the screen share and everything?
We're perfecting it. How is that, everybody?
All right.
Big enough?
Is it perfect? Are we ready?
I think we're ready.
Okay, keep going.
Yes, go ahead.
All right, moving on. So there's our roadmap, right? So before we get going, I've got lots of things I will tell you that's backed up by science and research, but I also have opinions because I've been doing this for a while, and I will give you those opinions, but I will try to be very clear about when I'm giving you opinion versus straight fact. Anywho, let's start with some terms, okay? So we talk about native and invasive a lot in terms of animals, plants, all that type of thing. Native simply means it's from here, right? And your next logical question is going to be, what does here mean? In terms of most things, you could look at here as a continental scale. So if it's from North America, anywhere in North America, it's native to North America. There are nuances, of course. You know, some people may say, well, if something is native to the US, what if it gets into Canada? It could easily travel less than a half a mile if it goes across the border in northern Minnesota, right? So just because it moves into one country from another does not mean it's invasive, because we got to remember that country boundaries are just kind of socioeconomic things that we're drawn on anyway. So native is from here for all intents and purposes on a continental scale. Several things mean that they are not from here. Non-native, exotic, alien, all of these things just simply mean that organism is not from the continent on which you are talking about it now. And then when we talk about invasive species, and these are the worst of the non-native ones, okay? So they are not from here. They have established populations. They cause some sort of damage, whether that's economic damage, ecological damage, could be human health hazard too, that's just as bad. And then oftentimes they displace native species. So those are kind of your 4 main things that makes an invasive species. And again, that is a small sliver of all the non-native stuff out there. So circling back to plants, are all non-native plants bad? It's important to remember they are not, right? So not every non-native plant is invasive. Many of the things we eat are not from North America. Potatoes, oranges, citrus, corn. You don't see potatoes growing wild all over the ditches, right? They're not an invasive species. They're just the non-native species that we as humans cultivate. So to consider a non-native plant bad, a lot of it has to do with context. So it depends. Bamboo is probably the second worst plant, in my opinion, in this particular country, especially the non-native bamboos. That said, in this picture, you're seeing a restaurant kind of near where I live. It's got a chunk of dirt that's about 3 feet wide by 20 feet long, and it's got bamboo in it. And since bamboo is not a plant that spreads by seed, at least not all that often, this is really a pretty contained chunk of bamboo that's not going anywhere. So it really gets down to location and then the biology of the particular plant you're talking about. In some situations, bamboo, this type of bamboo, is highly invasive. In this particular one, it's not going anywhere, it's not doing anything. Now, that being said, is this non-native plant bad? And I would say it is the worst. Doesn't matter what position or what scenario you're talking about, this tree pretty much sucks. So we'll get into that in a bit. But first, let's talk about the invasive plants and why they got here. There were two main reasons invasive plants came to this country. First, they were a reminder of home. I have cookies here. When I went to college, I used to bring chocolate chip cookies back that mom would make because it reminded me of home. And then the second reason most invasive plants were brought here back in the past was a business opportunity, right? People were coming to this new land and they saw opportunity to make money and increase their wealth. So that was a lot of reasons that things were brought here. And with plants, which is much different than with a lot of invasive insects, we know when a lot of these invasive plants came to this country because there are records. They were brought for a World's Fair, or a particular garden brought them, or a particular salesperson brought them. So we know when a lot of this stuff got here. And unfortunately, a lot of invasive plants are introduced as forages or ornamentals. These are the two main things that are the main reasons invasive plants were brought in, to feed animals or to sell as pretty plants, right? If you actually look at a list of what makes the ideal forage plant, and that's on the left there, it's pretty much the same characteristics of an invasive plant. You're looking at something that establishes easy, spreads fast, reproduces relatively easily, extremely hardy, and then doesn't have a lot of pest issues. That's exactly what people want if they're trying to grow up a good hayfield. That's exactly what happens when you have invasive plants. And, piggybacking on that, one of the reasons a lot of plants become invasive is nothing eats them. Very few things eat them. And here you see the relative percent of leaf damage on invasive and non-invasive plants. Invasive plants, by definition, don't have a lot of natural enemies here. And that's just one of the factors that makes them so good at spreading. They also have a little bit of plasticity, we call it, where they can grow in different ways in different scenarios. So this is believe it or not, this is one of our North American native tree species, Pinus taeta or loblolly pine. In South America, it is quite the invasive plant. And you see, you've got these areas where you have more invasive populations, meaning sort of the head of the surge, right? The very edge of where this thing is invading. These trees have more leaf area and they grow faster than trees that have kind of been there a lot longer. So as they're encroaching on new areas, they're growing at a much more rapid rate. Invasive plants produce a lot of seeds. This data is from Ailanthus altissima, or tree of heaven. A study a few years ago found out that in a 40-year lifetime, one tree can make about 10 million seeds. And when you think that seed viability for this tree is about 65%, that means in one tree's lifetime, you're looking at about 6.5 million viable seeds that could potentially become a new plant. So it's a huge amount of reproductive potential for a lot of these non-native plants. They establish in disturbed areas. This is a great shot from Australia, this juncus plant. It just completely takes over. And we see this with all sorts of stuff. I mean, pick an invasive up in the Northeast, out west, southeast. If it's an invasive area or if it's a disturbed area, those are most commonly taken over by a lot of invasive plants. Hardy roots or rhizomes is another characteristic that, a lot of invasive plants have. And it's just one of the strategies they have to deal with times when resources might not be available. They're very good at storing energy and carbohydrates in those roots and those rhizomes, and they can kind of live off them until they get into a more favorable environment. You've also got these really dense infestations. This is Cogon grass in North Florida. This is an invasive grass. This is that light green stuff you see there, and it will just choke out absolutely everything else around it so that all you have is Cogon grass, and it negatively impacts tree growth as well. It just really takes over stuff. And then just a wide tolerance to environmental conditions. Okay, here you see Phragmites growing in the concrete on the side of the road. One of my favorite memes is this one, where it basically shows the difference between garden plants, which typically take a lot of care, and weeds, which will grow almost anywhere with zero cares in the world, right? And then there's allelopathy, which is just a plant that produces a chemical that prevents another plant from growing. And a lot of plants do this. A lot of invasive plants do this. Probably the most famous example we have is the black walnut, where it produces juglone, which is why you rarely see a lot of other plants growing underneath a black walnut tree. And this is a strategy that allows that tree to take all the resources in that area. So in this example, they looked at a couple plants. They grew lettuce as just the thing that's the response. And so you've got seedling mass as you go up the y-axis there. And so there's this native plant, white snake root, which we know has allelopathy. And then you have another effect, or another plant, Japanese tiltgrass, which we did not know, but it has that same effect, right? It reduces the growth of lettuce when in its presence. So that's why a lot of times when you have microstegium, you'll have just big, intense infestations of it because nothing else will grow underneath there. And then finally, you've got the strategies these plants use. So sit and wait is common for a lot of the forested type ones. And Oriental bitterstreet is a great example. You'll have seedlings established after birds eat the berries and they poop them out in the woods, and the seedlings will grow a little bit and they'll just kind of wait for a tree to fall, whether natural causes or a windstorm or just cut down. And then it just completely explodes, takes over, and grows up that gap and takes over that tree. So those are some of the ways that, or some of the characteristics, I should say, that non-native plants and invasive plants especially have to establish and take over and become dominant in their areas. So let's talk about our favorite plant that we don't like, the Callery pear, also known as the Bradford pear. They're a little bit different. We will explain the differences, but they are all the same species. It's all Pyrus calleriana. Now, here it is. I will acknowledge and concede that, yes, it is very pretty in the spring. It just looks like kind of a white lollipop. Even the Callery pears that have a little different shape look, they're just bursts of white in the spring. But if anyone has been around one of these when it is blooming, you know there is a heck of an odor that comes from it. There are lots of descriptions for this odor. This one is my favorite, but there's lots of other really colorful descriptions for what Bradford pear flowers smell like. So why do we have Bradford pear in the first place? It goes back a while. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So in the late 1800s, in this country, there was a growing demand for new different types of crops, especially in the western, western US. Concurrently, at the same time, right, they started the USDA Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction Office. This was started in 1898, and their whole mission, their whole goal was essentially to find plants from other parts of the world and bring them here and see if we could use them to benefit life in what was at the time a new country, America, right? So that was a thing that at the time was a great idea. I think we know now that's a horrible idea, but at the time it seemed like the way to go, right? So the early 1900s, remember in the western part of the country, they were looking for other ways to diversify, basically, move on from ranching and do some other things. And so they started having orchards, and pears were one of the things that they were growing. They were growing edible pear, Pyrus communis, which is a European pear. And so in the early 1900s, they noticed fire blight was starting to become really, really rampant. And fire blight is a bacterium you can see that affects the fruits and leaves. It just kind of causes them to kind of brown up and dry up and wilt over. The kicker is it's spread by pollinators. And, these plants need pollinators to make fruit, right? We've probably heard a lot about how pollinators are so important to agriculture. This is one of the crops where you need pollinators to pollinate those flowers to make those fruits. So you've got this big fire blight issue happening with these pears. It's spread by pollinators. We need to do something. And they had known that there was a species of pear, Pyrus calleriana, that grew in China that was pretty resistant to fire blight. Not 100%, but pretty darn resistant. So they wanted to test that out. They had a couple, it seemed to work. They needed more of this Pyrus to test as rootstock. So the first guy that actually went over there to try to do a little work here, his name was Ernest Wilson, and he was with the Arnold Arboretum that's up in Massachusetts. He first brought P. calleriana to North America. And so after he did that, and there was some, there was success, they said we needed more of these things, and they sent this guy, Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer was the Michael Jordan of plant collectors back in the day. Extremely, extremely good at it. And keep in mind, this is in the early 1900s. That basically just means you survive the trip, right? Because you're taking a ship over there, you're doing all this stuff on foot. There's no cars, there's no ATVs. He was a survivor, and he came home with stuff he said he would. He's introduced so many plants to the U.S. that there's a medal named after him for some scientific societies. And if you've ever had a Meyer lemon, they were named after Frank Meyer, right? So he was a big deal in the plant collection community. And he collected Calleriana for a couple of years, 16 to 18, 1916 to 1918. He sent back 100 pounds of seed, and this was a massive undertaking because that means you need about 20,000 pounds of Pyrus Calleriana fruit. And if you've not seen them, we'll show a picture later. They're about the size of a marble, maybe a super ball at best. So that's a lot of fruit he collected to get that. And I know I just got done talking about how awesome he was at his job, and a sort of sick twist of fate, he actually died on one of his Pyrus Calleriana collections. He drowned in 1918. So that being said, what they did worked, right? So they got a bunch of this Pyrus Calleriana here to the States. It helped save that pear industry, and they did that by grafting, right? So you would take a scion or a living shoot from an edible pear, and you would graft it. You would essentially cut a notch or corresponding cuts, and you would tape those together, and these things would grow together. So you would end up having a grafted tree where you've got a rootstock of one species and a top portion of another species. So they had a bunch of outplantings, just plantings of Pyrus Calleriana, because, they need these for research. They had them at the U.S. Plant Introduction Station up in Glendale, Maryland, that was managed by this guy, John Creech. He was the horticulturalist. And as he's walking and noticing and looking at all these selections, he noticed that some of them probably had some horticultural value. He was seeing disease resistance, drought resistance, pollution resistance. He noticed that one selection was thornless, like one individual plant. It's thornless, pretty, you can't kill the thing. And so he named it Bradford after his former station director. Okay, so I always, when I first got into this Bradford Callery Pear thing, I thought there was some guy Bradford that named a tree after himself, and he was the one that should get my ire and my angst. But no, it's this guy, it's John Creech. And even in his later years, he's since passed on, but even when he was long retired, he was a Bradford pear apologist, saying, it's misunderstood and all this type of thing. So anyway, this is the guy to blame for Bradford pear. So again, Bradford pear is a grafted cultivar, same technique as they did for a lot of the fruit trees, right? You've got scions of Bradford, of that tree that had all those great characteristics, and you put them on P. Calleriana, but it's a different tree. So the difference here between like a fruit grafted cultivar and a Bradford grafted cultivar is the top and the bottom are both Pyrus Calleriana. They're both the same species. It's just that they are different genetics. It'd be like if you took my torso and put it on another person's legs and another person's, all the same, all human, but you've got the same top and different bottoms. Okay. And so this is important because, there's some differences between the Bradford cultivar, the Bradford genetics, and the Callery. One of the main ones is the thorns, right? So here's a branch from both Bradford and Callery pear. And if you look closely, there's these massive thorns coming off the Bradford pear. That and just growth form are kind of two of the biggest things. So they made these Bradford pears, these grafted cultivars, okay? Commercially released them in 1961, and in what should have been a massive red flag, they noticed that even a few years later, you had escaped individuals into natural areas, right? In Arkansas, Maryland, so they're being sold all over the East. They also noticed that once these things got about 20 years old, you had structural problems. But at that point, they were selling so many of these things that, the snowball was rolling downhill, so they just kept on going. So they knew there were branch structure issues around 25 to 30 years old. These things break in rain, in wind, in snow. This is one of my favorite tweets. They will break if you look at them wrong, I swear. So they're very, very fragile. One of the other issues is that the whole sterility thing. Bradfords are marketed as being sterile, which is like kind of a half-truth type of thing. So if you have nothing but Bradford pears because they're self-incompatible, you will not get a viable seed. So if this is your whole town, your whole isolated town, everyone is a Bradford, there will not be viable seeds as long as no pollen is coming in from the outside from Pyrus. But it takes that one neighbor, and we've probably all got one, that plants a different cultivar, a Chanticleer or Aristocrat, whatever. And then all of a sudden you've got two different sets of genetics, and all these things can be pollinated, and you've got viable seed everywhere. This grafting and this issue can manifest into where you have essentially two trees in one plant. So here you see these were grafted Bradford pears, right? But you can see a shoot has grown from the base, from the rootstock, and it is different. So same species, but you've got two different trees, and you can see they're different because you've got on the left-hand side there, you've got one's half of the tree, one stem, which is pretty much leafed out, and the other one is still breaking bud. And on the right, you've got one that's pretty much, almost leafed out, and the other one's still in full flower. So these are both Pyrus Calleriana. One side is Bradford, one side is just general Pyrus Calleriana. So in this situation, that tree can pollinate itself and make viable seeds just with that one tree alone, because there's technically two sets of genetics there. So this is the thing. They knew that if you had other Pyrus, you would get seeds, but their response was basically to shrug, because at this point, you're just making so much money off these things. What are you going to do, right? And so let's talk about seed production, because this is the primary means in which these things spread all around. And yes, they can spread with root suckers, but seeds is how you get that long distance dispersal. Birds love to eat these things. Some of the larger seeds, in some cases I've seen fruits, I should say, that are, almost as big as a golf ball, and things like deer and raccoons will eat those. This was a mature Callery pear kind of down here in Georgia where I live. And I took this one stem, this is a couple of years ago, about 42 inches long, 23 different shoots on it. Here's the exact shoot I took right there, right? And here you can see it's in my hand. And so this is what it looks like when I plucked every leaf off that shoot. There's a lot of fruits on there, right? Here is the pile of fruit. I did this on the kitchen table, much to my wife's chagrin, but she's very tolerant of me, so she let this go. So this is the fruit, 200 live fruits and 12 dead fruits. And keep in mind, there's 3 to 5 seeds inside of each one of those little fruits. So you're looking just in that chunk of branch, you're looking at 600 to 1,000 possible seeds in there. It's a ridiculous volume of seed production. And we've got lots of work on going to figure out how viable they are, what's the percent viability and all that. But even at 10% viability, which is pretty low, that's just so many seeds that can get spread out there. And so this is one of the reasons when you have wild Callery pear all over the place. Okay, we've got it all over in old fields, along roadsides. It's typically the first thing to bloom every spring. Unsold lots are very common. Bradford pear was planted all over the Southeast, in the early 90s. So it's kind of escaped. And more recently, last decade or so, we are seeing it really creep into actual forests, production forests. Here you see a bunch of Callery pear understory in a pure pine stand. And so this stand gets burned every 2 to 3 years, and the pile of Callery pear just pops up, immediately right afterwards. So we also see it in pastures. This can be an issue sometimes with livestock, especially in all these little bushes here, all Callery pear. And so when we look at where is Callery pear on the landscape, we've got a map, but it's pretty incomplete, honestly. It's probably closer to this when you look at what's the actual range of this stuff. And, the question of how much Callery pear is out there is a good one. Here's a shot from Wichita. We've tried to use some of the digital imagery to determine how much is there, since it gets so white in the spring. But it's actually, if you see right down the bottom left, the white signature of a Callery pear in bloom is basically the same as concrete, or concrete, I should say. Yeah. So it makes it really tough. So we're still working on it, but there's been some numbers, and you can see in some cases you've got 134,000 individuals per hectare. Hectare is about 2.5 football fields in size. It's a ridiculous volume of stuff. Some would say, who cares? It's absolutely beautiful, right? You've got these white flowers, it's bright red foliage in the fall. If you dealt with this at all, you have thorns up the wazoo that are just so hard, and they puncture everything. So let me get to why Calleriana is the worst tree. And so we talked about the impacts of this tree. Callery pear is essentially the perfect invasive plant. And one of my former grad students, Shawani Sapkata at the University of Tennessee, she did a number of genetic studies, and basically every genetic thing that makes a really good invasive plant, Callery pear has it. And even going way back to, this is Frank Meyer, a letter Frank Meyer wrote to another guy back in the early 1900s. He even wrote that it grows in all these different places, right? It grows, what's it say? Groves, scattered specimens, large trees. It's everywhere, right? So this thing is known to grow and invade everywhere. And indeed, and even in places that are heavily grazed like this, these things will get there. And if you think, well, how can it get established right there in an open pasture? Well, right on the edge of the pasture, you've got these massive host trees, nurse trees, right? That are just making seed, and birds are going to eat it and fly, and they will spread everywhere. And so they grow extremely fast. Here's one that is 1 year of growth. Now, keep in mind, Alex is not the tallest young lady there. She's just over 5 feet tall, but you're looking at a solid 6.5 foot of growth on 1 year for these things. And then this is a shot from just kind of where I live. And you can see here's a row of Bradford pears. And you can just see where the birds will eat that and then fly over this open field and poop as they go and spread these things, right? So these things get spread quite a bit. Callery pear canopy is extremely thick. Okay, and I went into a thicket and I just looked up and I took a picture, and there's very little sunlight coming in there. You can see, again, not much grows underneath Callery pear thickets, and all those stems you see are Callery pears. There's really almost no ecological value with the Bradford pear. You know, you talk a lot about birds, and birds need insects to raise their young. It's been estimated 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of chickadees. That's a lot of little caterpillars just for some small birds. And one of the things we do know is that when you have non-native plants, you typically don't have a lot of insects, because again, insects co-evolve with stuff native. You bring something new in here, they're not going to be able to eat it, or just not eat it. And when you don't have insects, you don't have as many birds. And there's some great work by Desiree Narango that showed where you have areas where there's more non-native plants, you actually have less birds happening in those areas. So we know the presence of these plants impacts the ecology as a whole. We've been doing a bit of work too. Does it affect decomposers, right? And remember, you've got a Callery pear thicket, you've got a very different understory happening there. So maybe we've got some studies in progress where we're looking at twigs of different native and non-native species, and what all those, remember, every time there's dead wood on the ground, there's a bunch of stuff that has to come and break it down. So far, preliminarily, Callery pear is kind of in the middle. So some stuff will feed on it, some stuff certainly won't. We're also looking at some larger logs. So we've got this Clayton Traylor. He's a PhD student at the University of Georgia. We set logs out for a year. Was it a year? Yeah, I think it was a year. And then we put them in these big bags to let things emerge from them. And so that's in progress right now. One of the bigger impacts to me is from management of Callery pear. These can be very significant. I have a tractor here because one of the most common calls we get in extension is when people are trying to clear Callery pear from their land and they get their tires popped by those thorns. These thorns are very, very stout. They're very strong. You can see here's one coming right through a tire. You pop a tractor tire, that is not something you just quick whip out your stuff and change. That's a fairly big issue. And then, a lot of people spend a lot of time and a lot of money trying to manage these things. There's cost of time, there's cost of the product itself, there's all the safety issues. So once you've got an area that's invaded with Callery pear, it's a really significant task to try to get rid of that stuff as well. Is there anything good about this tree? Every now and again, you'll see some things pop up with they'll try to defend, the Bradford pear, the Callery pear. Some fruit growers I know dig up wild Callery pears, which sounds awesome, until you then learn that they graft fruit-bearing cultivars to it. In this picture especially, you can even see those thorny Callery pear branches on the bottom, which just means they are going to produce flowers eventually that will be pollinated by other pyrus, and you're going to get fruit off them. You're going to get Callery pear fruit off this thing. So I understand the concept in trying to do the right thing. And then maybe in isolated cases, when people keep all the Callery sprouts off, it can work. Okay, I'll give you that, fine. As a landscape tree, we don't have any idea on the annual sales value, but you can buy these things with some keystrokes in a Google, right? And you can still find some of these things at the big box stores. Again, because of the things we've already said about their fragility, I don't know why you would, but it can be done. So When pressed, if there's anything good about this tree, they photosynthesize fine. That's always a good thing, right? They do provide structure and cover for certain little varmints and birds, which is fine. They're occasionally used for nesting, storing food. So yes, there's positive in everything, right? But does the good outweigh the bad? And I would say that's absolutely not. This tree still just completely is horrible, in my opinion. And anyone that says, well, I'm gonna keep mine isolated, there's no chance that will ever happen. There's no longer any chance that any Pyrus calleriana you plant will not make viable seed, because there's just too much other Pyrus pollen in the world between the just naturalized stuff, the other things people plant. There's just too much out there. And so anytime I see these in defense of Bradford pears, I just, it's time to just let that go. The pros of this tree are far, far, far outweighed by the negatives. With that said, now where are we? Right now, our job, and my job as a extension professor, is figure out how to manage this thing, which is usually how to eliminate it. So there's a number of ways we can manage non-native plants. We'll go through each of them and see if they're good for Pyrus calleriana. So one of the first ways is just pulling it or girdling it, okay? Is hand pulling an option for Callery pear? I would say in some cases, maybe. If you've got true seedlings, they pop up pretty easily, but the minute you've got a resprout, it's not going to work. It's going to break off, and it's just simply going to regrow, right? So if it's a true seedling, yeah, you can probably pull that up fairly easily. Girdling alone for Callery pear, or frankly, any hardwood tree, is not going to do it. Okay, so here's a big, fairly good size one that we cut, and it just started growing. And you even see the chunk that we left on the ground. The buds that were touching the ground started to root, and the ones that were above the ground started to grow as well. So this will eventually grow into a bunch of different trees off that one stem. So if you cut down a Bradford pear tree, I would say, as the great Bon Jovi once said, you're halfway there, because you have to use herbicide, or else it's going to completely resprout at the stump, and any large root that's near the top of the soil or top of the ground is going to send up a shoot. Grazing is another very common invasive plant management thing we see now. It might be an option. I kind of doubt it. Maybe for the thornless seedlings. To my knowledge, no one's really tried it. But once these things get thorns on them, I mean, it's going to cut animals up. And we've seen that in that little horse picture in the pasture. That horse had her face just completely shredded because she ran into those Callery pears. So maybe on the new stuff that doesn't have the thorns, this works, maybe not. So you've got mechanical or cultural control, super common for things like bamboo, where you can put an actual, ground fence, so to speak, in there and stop the spread of them. For Callery pear, it works sometimes, right? You can always dig a tree up, but that means you're digging the entire tree up. So if you're going to do that for these mature ones, yeah, that works. Like, that tree's not coming back, but that's a significant amount of effort for one tree. Mowing might work. If once trees are about as big as they are in this picture, they're certainly not going to mow over those. You've also got a risk of popping those tires. If it's an area where you're going to mow probably every year, you could probably keep them in check. But the minute you skip a year, they're going to be too big to mow, and they're going to have really thick woody stems, and that's probably not going to cut it anymore. Burning is something that a lot of forest managers do. So is burning an option? So this is going to be context dependent for Callery pear, right? So it depends. So for seeds and fruit, maybe burning would work. And I'm looking at some data from Russian olive. So they showed that the higher burn intensity you have, the more seedlings and seeds actually died. So you can kill a lot of seeds and seedlings by burning. It's just the trick is going to be having an environment where you've got enough fuel to carry a fire. Okay. Saplings, you're not going to kill saplings by burning them. Here's a study from, this is one from Indiana. They see where there was a pre-fire, there were no sprouts. And then after they burned it, there was 3 to 4 sprouts per individual after the fire. So the fire just made them come back angry, more or less. And even here's another one from Ohio, where they looked at stems that were cut, stems that were killed by burning, and then stems that were actually killed by freezing. All of these have such a super vigorous resprout response to any type of damage. The only one you can see on the far right there, herbicide. Herbicide kills them, and we'll get to herbicide in a minute, but If you're just going to cut them or burn them, or if they freeze off, they're just going to come back up. Here's just a simple picture, a picture we got from the middle of Georgia. A fire had gone over here, prescribed fire. You can see for each of these little bushes of Callery pear, that's where they regrew. And we found between 2 and 12 resprouts per sapling for Callery pear. Mature trees are, you can probably get a fire on here, but at some point, all of those trees are going to have bark that's just too thick and it's not going to do anything to them. So it's highly doubtful that would work once a tree really gets 6, 8, 12 feet tall. Biocontrol is an option we use for invasive plants. For Callery pear, that's just it's not gonna happen unless there's something new we find. But at this point, we know that we talked already about the importance of native species to support native herbivores that support native birds, right? So Doug Talmy, Delaware, he's looked at some of this stuff up quite a bit. And the Cliff Notes version is nothing eats Callery pear. Again, that is a characteristic that makes it a successful invader. And that is a characteristic that made it desirable as a horticultural species. Now, this is from up north. We've also looked down here in the deep south, and I'll give you a full list of everything I've seen eating Callery pear. Okay, if you're ready, we'll start. Aphids, I've seen aphids on there. Thrips, I think I see them. I've seen a bagworm or two. I know this isn't Callery pear, but I have seen bagworms on Callery pear. That's it. Nothing eats these things. Okay, so we explored this a little bit. We took 3 really, really generalist feeders, and we just want to see, will anything eat Callery pear? Okay, so fall webworm, eastern tent caterpillar, Japanese beetle. We did a great big lab study, and what we found was not really. We found that by and large, in a choice test, they will eat everything else. We gave them red maple, mockernut hickory, and black cherry. They would much prefer that. If you put insects with Callery pear, there was no choice, all you had in there was a Callery pear leaf tissue, a lot of them just died. They would take some nibbles and then they would just die. So Callery pear is very herbivore free, which brings me to herbicides. I mean, in some cases, this is the tactic that is going to work. And just before we get into that, just a reminder, labels of law. If you're going to use these, you've got to follow them to a T with what's written on there. So is herbicide an option? Yes. Honestly, herbicide is the only one of the main viable options for Callery pear control. We've done several trials on this already. We've looked in South Carolina and Georgia with what we call small trees, 6 feet or so. Here's one of our study plots. You can see the pears there in the foreground. And we set up several different herbicides. And the take home is that all of these things worked. You just got to put something on there. In the one case where we had hexazinone that didn't work, it's because we didn't get enough rain following, and it just didn't quite take. But all of the foliar stuff worked great. We followed this up with kind of what we call a medium tree trial in several states. Here you can see Ryan is super psyched to cut this thing down, as everyone should be. We did some hack and squirt, some cut stump, pretty good kill. And again, the Cliff Notes version is hack and squirt works, cut stump works, hexazinone and imazapyr. Maybe there's some nuances with the data there. We're not quite finished, but I think some of that's going to depend on applicator technique, is I think what's going to get down to. But if you do this stuff the right way, you've got pretty darn good chances for herbicides to work, especially if it's a cut stump or it's a hack and squirt type scenario. The kicker to all of this is that many invasive plants are still obtainable and promoted. You can buy a lot of these things online. Here's Imperatta, that's going to be Kogon grass. You can get, wisteria, Callery Pear, buy all this crap, all from your computer while social distancing, right? For $20, you can get one of these things delivered. So one of the other things we've started doing is community outreach, and we've got our Bradford Pear Bounty program. This is something I would encourage you all to do up there. And so it's kind of a three-headed monster. So we've got cooperative extension, we've got our state forestry commission, and then we work with another municipality. And so Clemson Extension, we do a lot of the outreach stuff. And what this program is we give a free native replacement tree to anyone that will cut down their Bradford pear and just bring us a picture as proof. That's all you need to do. So we do a lot of the advertising. We do a lot of the media to get the word out, set up the website, all that type of thing. Our commission chips in by helping these municipalities figure out which replacement trees to use. We've got a fairly diverse state going from the coast all the way up to the mountains. So trees you might give away on the coast are not something you want to plant up in the mountains. So we have to kind of tailor each event to where it is. And then the local municipality does, a lot of the on the ground things, have a spot for us, take care of trees, that type of thing. We've given away almost 12, well, more than this at this point, over 1,300 trees, I think at this point, been increasing every year. And one of the things that we've been trying to look at and ask people is where they're getting this information. And luckily, a lot of the information does get to them through reputable sources. So Clemson Extension, the state agencies, that type of thing. So we feel pretty good about this program. It's a great way to talk to people and tell them the importance of planting native species, why you shouldn't plant a non-native species, and then get them to do that by giving them some free trees. I know this program has gone to other states, which is great. In our state, we have taken some regulatory action. We've banned the sale of Calleriana, Pyrus Calleriana, starting in October of 24. So places will not be able to sell this plant. And so before I end, I will just ask people, I ask you personally, plant native species in urban landscapes. And if you have influence on other entities, municipalities, people, don't be afraid to ask them to also plant native species. There's just so many reasons why you should do that, why it's worth doing that. And that is one of our main messages. And with that, I've left some time, and I'd be happy to take any questions about any of this stuff whatsoever.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Make sure, are we unmuted still? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great, we're unmuted. Any questions in the room?
Can we get a copy of the presentation? It's really good.
Yes, you can.
Yep, we've also recorded it and we'll be posting it on YouTube with your permission. Can we post it on YouTube?
Go for it.
Well, do you have a question? Yes? Were you able to hear the question?
I didn't hear a thing. No, you have to repeat.
Oh, yeah, sorry. We have a microphone at this table and not at the far one. But she asked if there are any programs in New York City. In kind of, are you talking about like the bounty program? In tree pits. Okay. Yeah, they're in tree pits in the city. Do you know of anything happening in New York City?
No, I don't know anything happening in New York City. These programs are not hard to do. So I'd encourage you, if there isn't one, just start one. It's not that hard. The biggest kicker is, getting the trees to give away. We give away trees that are in 3-gallon pots. So they range from, 2 to 6 feet tall. We give away that size rather than seedlings because we want to make sure those trees have a chance of living. And remember, most people don't know what they're doing. So you want to give them a tree that's got a chance of surviving. There's a much smaller chance that a tree of that size is going to be run over by a wayward lawnmower, right? I mean, if you've got an actual tree in there, and people feel a lot better getting something that, they have to carry out of there versus a little wimpy seedling. I mean, that's lame. So we get trees that are actually trees. It works out from the nurseries we have around us, roughly $10 a tree delivered. So when we give out 200, you're looking at $2,000 to $2,500. And I'll be honest, that is not a very big amount of money to power companies. And we've had a lot of sponsorship from like Duke Energy because a lot of Bradford pears were planted underneath power lines. And as described to me, trimming one Bradford pear tree on their part is basically supporting a whole program. Probably a couple grand for them to trim one tree when you figure out all the stuff that goes into it. So if you can get hooked up with local power companies, they're probably going to look at this as a great marketing opportunity. Give them a chance to set up a table at the event and like talk to people. That's been really successful for us so far. So that's honestly the biggest hurdle is getting the stuff, and it turned out to be not as hard as we thought it would be.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions in the room? I saw there's some. Oh yeah, you see that there?
I see a comment. Can you talk about the process for getting the regulation passed?
There it is.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is going to vary depending on what state you're in. I can tell you every state does things a little bit differently. I cannot speak to how New York works. You guys will have to figure that out. But in South Carolina, we have a committee, an advisory council called the Invasive Species Advisory Council. And so our job is to look at the state's natural resources and make recommendations on invasive species issues, right? So every year we have this plant list that we try to update. And so we decided that Pyrus calleriana shouldn't be sold. There was also a few Elaeagnus, the non-native Elaeagnus species, so the Russian olive, thorny olive, all those. And we put a proposal up to ban the sale of those with the justification that they are, not good for the natural areas of South Carolina. After that, it goes to our state regulatory head, who then basically puts it on fancier letterhead and sends it up to one of the state legislative committees that talks about it. We get all the input from all the stakeholders, right? So there's public hearings, that type of thing. Assuming it gets through that state legislative committee, and again, in South Carolina, then it goes up for a full House and Senate vote at the state level, and then the governor signs it. So it took about 2 years, and it was over COVID too, so maybe it wouldn't take that long normally, but it took us about 2 years by the time it went from this is what we want to do to the governor finally signed it. And we had to include a couple of years buffer in there, which is why it doesn't start till October 1 of 24. Because we are also not in the business of putting business out of business. We don't want to put people under for this. So one of the concessions that had to be made was we gave a couple of years for people to get rid of what they had, with the understanding that as of October 1 of 24, you cannot sell it anywhere in the state. So it was a very interesting lesson in how the government and how things work, how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Thank you. I was just checking our Part 575 list to see if it is prohibited to sell, and I don't think it is yet. No. So, but for those interested in New York State regulations that aren't familiar, Part 575 is what you can look up. And we also have some booklets of the prohibited invasive plants and animals here in person too, if you want to check them out.
And I'll say the biggest hurdle you may have is from the fruit growers and horticultural businesses, because Calleriana is a very widely used rootstock because you can't kill it, right? I mean, that's what they want out of a rootstock. So that, we were fortunate in South Carolina. We don't have a huge industry that uses that. We don't produce a lot of, the fruit we produce is mostly peaches, and they don't use Pyrus calleriana for that. But I know there are other states where Pyrus calleriana as a rootstock is a major thing, and those states are going to have a really hard time and possibly never passing something like this because of that reason.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions in the room or virtually? Put them in the chat. Mm-hmm.
That's it. I answered everything. That's amazing.
I think you did. Well, anyway, if you have any questions lingering, we'll be posting this on YouTube, and yeah. And thank you again, Dr. David Coyle, for a great presentation.
Happy to do it. Reach out anytime if you all got questions. I love talking about this stuff. I know I badmouthed it a lot, but it's a lot of what we do, and we've got a lot of work going on in this realm, so we're always happy to share it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to hear from another region too.
All right, thank you. We'll see you. Bye, everybody.
So we are a little bit running ahead of schedule a bit, so we can take another break with our next presentation on remote sensing and invasive species management starting at noon. So be free.